For centuries, history has been shaped by lies, misconceptions and myths that have been passed down through generations. What if everything you thought you knew about the past was wrong? In this video, we're exposing 50 historical lies that modern evidence has completely destroyed. These myths didn't just distort the truth, they changed the course of history. Get ready to uncover the shocking truths you've never been told. Chapter 1. The Dark Ages Myth. The so-called Dark Ages have long been portrayed as a time of ignorance and stagnation following the fall of the Roman Empire. History books paint this period as one where Europe fell into a deep intellectual slump, where art, culture, and knowledge came to a screeching halt. But what if that's not true? The truth is far more complex. While the fall of Rome did disrupt Europe, other parts of the world were thriving, especially in the East, where the Islamic Golden Age was ushering in advances in science, medicine, and mathematics. The idea of a dark Europe ignores the fact that knowledge was preserved in monasteries, and the groundwork for future advancements was being laid even during this so-called dark time. The human cost of this myth. It not only misrepresented a vibrant, dynamic era, but also undermined the achievements of those who lived through it. They were made to seem irrelevant to the progress of humanity, but this wasn't the only historical era to be misrepresented. Chapter 2. The Noble Savage Myth. The term noble savage was coined to romanticize indigenous peoples as pure, untarnished by the corrupting forces of civilization. Early European explorers used this image to justify their conquests, portraying indigenous groups as innocent, noble beings, untouched by the modern world. But the truth is far more damaging. The noble savage myth ignored the complexities of these societies. Indigenous peoples were not simple or primitive. They had rich cultures, established trade networks, and advanced technologies long before Europeans arrived. This myth was a tool to dehumanize and justify colonization, often leading to the violent subjugation, forced assimilation, and destruction of entire civilizations. The human cost of this lie? It perpetuated stereotypes that erased the dignity of indigenous cultures and justified the brutal treatment they endured. Indigenous peoples were seen as blank slates to be civilized by European settlers. But the lies didn't stop here. The next myth might make you rethink the history we've been taught about another culture. Chapter 3. The Savage Viking Myth. For centuries, Vikings were painted as nothing more than savage raiders, pillaging and burning their way across Europe. Popular history depicts them as ruthless barbarians who terrorized the coasts. But this image is a distortion of the truth. Vikings weren't just violent invaders, they were skilled explorers, traders, and settlers. They built expansive trade, routes stretching from North America to the Middle East, influencing culture and commerce across vast regions. Their ships revolutionized navigation, and their contributions to law and governance were far more sophisticated than previously believed. The human cost of this myth? It reduced an entire civilization to a simple, bloodthirsty stereotype, overshadowing their far-reaching impact on the world. Vikings didn't just destroy, they connected people and ideas. But what happens when history distorts the legacy of one of the most iconic figures in ancient Egypt? Stay tuned, because what you'll learn about Cleopatra will challenge everything you thought you knew. Chapter 4. Cleopatra's Egyptian Heritage. Myth Cleopatra is often remembered as the epitome of ancient Egypt, an Egyptian queen who captivated Rome and the world. But here's the truth. Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian. She was of Greek descent, a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for centuries. Her heritage is often overlooked or intentionally distorted to fit a narrative. By portraying Cleopatra as the face of Egypt, history ignored the Greek influence that shaped her reign. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt as foreign rulers, and Cleopatra's true legacy was tied to her ability to navigate both Greek and Egyptian politics. The human cost of this myth? It obscured Egypt's rich, native history and its dynamic, complex culture, giving the world a false image of Egypt as a conquered land, rather than a thriving, independent civilization. Cleopatra's true impact was more political and intellectual than the romanticized tale we know today. But Cleopatra's myth wasn't the only one carefully crafted for political gain. What happens next will reveal another fabricated story that shaped royal history. Chapter 5. Marie Antoinette's "let them eat cake" myth. Marie Antoinette's name is forever tied to the phrase "let them eat cake," a symbol of her heartless indifference toward the suffering of the French people. This famous quote has been drilled into our collective memory, but here's the shocking truth. She never said it. This phrase was actually invented by revolutionary propagandists to fuel hatred toward the Queen and justify the violent uprisings of the French Revolution. In reality, Marie Antoinette was far from the out-of-touch symbol of decadence she's made out to be. While her political actions were often misguided, she was not the callous monarch history has painted. The human cost of this myth: it created a scapegoat, directing the anger and frustration of the masses onto an individual, when in truth, the deeper issues lay within France's economic and political system. Marie Antoinette's image was shattered, and the revolution was fueled by a lie. But this myth is just one example of how history has distorted the truth to serve an agenda. The next myth might hit even closer to home. Chapter 6. The Merciless Aztecs Myth. The Aztecs are often remembered for their brutal human sacrifices, a practice that many portray as an act of mindless violence. This image of savage bloodletting has long overshadowed the real story of the Aztec civilization. While it's true that human sacrifice was part of Aztec religious ceremonies, it wasn't as widespread or as violent as we've been led to believe. Sacrifice was deeply tied to their cosmology and was seen as a necessary offering to their gods to ensure balance in the world. Their achievements in agriculture, mathematics, and astronomy were revolutionary, and their cities were among the most advanced in the world at the time. The human cost of this myth? It reduced a complex, sophisticated civilization to a barbaric stereotype, distorting their true legacy and erasing their remarkable contributions. The Aztecs weren't savages, they were visionaries. But the myth of the savage didn't end with the Aztecs. In fact, the next chapter will reveal how another barbaric civilization has been misrepresented. Chapter 7. The Barbaric Gauls. Myth Julius Caesar's accounts of the Gauls painted them as savage, uncivilized barbarians, no match for the might of the Roman Empire. But Caesar's view was biased, written to justify the Roman conquest and to elevate Rome's triumph. The truth is that the Gauls were a sophisticated people with rich cultural traditions. They had advanced artistic skills, a strong warrior code, and a complex system of social organisation. They built powerful tribal federations and were expert in metalwork and trade. The Gauls were far from the unrefined barbarians Caesar claimed them to be. The human cost of this myth: it oversimplified their culture, making it easier for the Romans to justify the invasion and subsequent massacre. The truth about the Gauls has been buried beneath Caesar's narrative. But this historical distortion wasn't an isolated case. What happens next reveals how the world misjudged another great empire, the mighty Vikings. Chapter 8. The Bloody Roman Gladiators. Myth. When we think of Roman gladiators, images of bloody battles and brutal death matches often come to mind. The popular narrative paints them as mere pawns in a fight to the death for public entertainment. But the truth is more complicated. Many gladiators were actually highly trained athletes, revered in Roman society. They fought in brutal competitions, yes, but not all of them were slaves. Some volunteered, seeking fame and fortune. Far from being mindless fighters, many gladiators became celebrities in their own right, with loyal followings and significant influence. The human cost of this myth: it oversimplified the gladiatorial games and the men who fought in them. It turned them into mere symbols of violence, ignoring the honour, discipline, and respect they often commanded. But the way we misrepresent history doesn't stop with gladiators. The next chapter will uncover the myth surrounding one of history's most iconic leaders, one who is still remembered for his savage conquest. Chapter 9. The Lost Cause. Myth. The Lost Cause narrative romanticizes the Confederacy's role in the American Civil War, portraying the South's defeat as a noble stand for states' rights rather than the defense of slavery. This myth has shaped perceptions of the Civil War for over a century. The truth? The Confederacy was founded on the protection of slavery, with the Southern states explicitly stating their desire to maintain the institution in their secession documents. The Lost Cause myth downplays slavery's role in the war and casts the Confederacy as a misunderstood, honourable resistance. The human cost of this myth. It perpetuated racial injustice and allowed the ideology of white supremacy to persist long after the war ended. By painting the Confederacy as a victim, the myth obscured the real suffering caused by slavery. But this isn't the only myth to distort American history. Up next, we uncover the real story behind the Founding Fathers and the truth about their involvement in the nation's original sins. Chapter 10. The wicked Queen Marie Antoinette myth. Marie Antoinette's name has been synonymous with royal excess and indifference to the suffering of the French people. Her supposed words, "let them eat cake," have been immortalised as a symbol of her callousness. But the truth couldn't be further from this myth. This phrase was never hers. It was a revolutionary fabrication designed to vilify the Queen and turn the masses against her. While Marie Antoinette was indeed unpopular, largely due to France's economic struggles, she wasn't the heartless figure history makes her out to be. The human cost of this lie. It scapegoated her for the broader economic issues facing France, feeding public anger and fueling the violence of the revolution. She was punished not just for her actions, but for a myth crafted to turn the tide of public opinion. But the manipulation of history didn't stop with the French Revolution. The next myth takes us to the fall of one of the greatest empires in history, the Roman Empire. Chapter 11. The medieval flat earth. Myth for centuries, people were taught that medieval scholars believed the earth was flat. This myth has been used to discredit the Middle Ages as a dark time of ignorance and superstition. But the reality is far different. The idea that people in the Middle Ages thought the earth was flat is completely false. In fact, ancient Greek and Roman scholars had already proven the earth was spherical, and by the Middle Ages, this knowledge was widely accepted in Europe. Medieval scholars, including monks, were far from ignorant. They preserved and expanded upon ancient knowledge. The human cost of this myth. It paints the Middle Ages as a period of intellectual stagnation, erasing the true intellectual achievements of the time. This false narrative allows us to overlook the complex, rich history of medieval Europe. But this wasn't the only lie about the past. Up next, we'll expose the myth surrounding the barbarism of the Celts, another distortion that shaped perceptions for centuries. Chapter 12. The barbaric Gauls. Myth Julius Caesar's conquest of the Gauls is one of history's most famous military campaigns. In his writings, he portrayed the Gauls as uncivilized barbarians, uncultured, primitive, and easy to conquer. But this narrative was a distortion of the truth. In reality, the Gauls were far from barbaric. They were skilled artisans, warriors, and traders with complex social structures. Their culture was rich in art and music and spirituality, and they had a sophisticated understanding of nature and the world around them. Caesar's portrayal of them as savage was strategic. He needed to justify his conquest and solidify his reputation. The human cost of this myth. It erased the Gauls' true cultural contributions, reducing them to mere pawns in Caesar's political game. This distortion of their legacy still affects the way we view Celtic peoples today, but the distortion of history didn't stop there. The next chapter will delve into the brutal image of the Mongols, one of history's most misunderstood empires. Chapter 13. The evil Mongol myth. The Mongols are often remembered for their brutal invasions and pillaging under Genghis Khan's leadership, but the truth behind their empire is much more nuanced and complex. While it's true that the Mongols were formidable warriors, they weren't just ruthless conquerors. They were also strategic rulers who created one of the largest empires in history, connecting East and West through trade, cultural exchange, and diplomacy. Their empire brought stability to vast regions and facilitated the spread of knowledge, technology, and culture. The human cost of this myth. The Mongols have been unjustly demonized as nothing more than savages. Their true legacy of innovation, tolerance, and governance has been obscured by the myth of mindless violence. But the Mongols weren't the only ones whose legacy was twisted by historical myths. In the next chapter, we'll expose the lies surrounding one of history's most iconic kings. Chapter 14. The uncivilized Native Americans myth. When European settlers first encountered Native Americans, they often described them as primitive, uncivilized beings living in a state of nature. This myth has persisted for centuries, shaping how we view indigenous cultures. The reality? Native American societies were incredibly diverse, with complex systems of government, social structures, and technological innovations. Many tribes had advanced agricultural practices, sophisticated art forms, and deep spiritual traditions. The idea that they were uncivilized was a way to justify colonization and the erasure of their cultures. The human cost of this myth: it marginalized entire civilizations and justified the violent expansion of European empires across the Americas. Native American cultures were dismissed as inferior, paving the way for exploitation and forced assimilation. The lies surrounding indigenous peoples didn't stop there. In fact, the next myth will challenge everything you thought you knew about the savage Spartans. Chapter 15. The Civilized Spartans Myth. The Spartans have long been celebrated as the epitome of virtue and discipline, admired for their fierce warrior ethos and their role in the defence of Greece. But the truth behind Sparta's greatness is far darker. Sparta's society was built on the subjugation of the Helots, a class of enslaved people who were forced to work the land and serve the Spartan elite. The brutal treatment of the Helots was central to the Spartan way of life, yet this is often ignored in favour of romanticising their militarism. The human cost of this myth? It oversimplified Sparta's legacy, turning them into symbols of heroic virtue while ignoring the system of oppression that made their society possible. But the myth of Spartan greatness wasn't the only distortion of ancient history. The next chapter will expose a dark side of Roman history that's often overlooked. Chapter 16. The End of History. Myth. At the end of the Cold War, many declared that history itself had reached its endpoint, that liberal democracy had triumphed over communism, and we were entering an era of unchallenged peace and prosperity. But this myth of the end of history was oversimplified at best. The truth is, the world didn't suddenly become a utopia. The collapse of the Soviet Union created new conflicts, political unrest, and economic instability in countries once under Soviet control. And far from bringing peace, it exposed deep inequalities that were ignored during the Cold War. The human cost of this myth: it led to complacency, ignoring the struggles that still existed around the world. The world did not enter a post-history era. It simply evolved into new challenges. The lie of the end of history shows just how easy it is to overlook the complexities of our time. In the next chapter, we uncover another myth that shaped the course of American history. Chapter 17. The Revolutionary. American Revolution Myth. The American Revolution is often seen as a noble fight for freedom, a struggle against tyranny. But this narrative hides the truth about who was actually fighting for freedom and who was left behind. The reality? While the American colonies rebelled against British rule, they were also protecting the institution of slavery, which was deeply entrenched in the South. The fight for liberty didn't extend to enslaved Africans, and in fact, the revolution's leaders were often slaveholders themselves. The human cost of this myth: it glossed over the brutality of slavery, painting the revolution as a purely virtuous movement. This distortion erased the stories of the enslaved people who were fighting their own battles for freedom in the midst of the war. The story of the revolution is far more complex than we've been told. In the next chapter, we'll uncover the truth behind another historical, noble cause: the so-called Crusades of the medieval period. Chapter 18. The Healthy Ancient Roman Medicine Myth. Ancient Rome is often celebrated for its engineering marvels, military conquests, and architectural feats. But Roman medicine, widely viewed as advanced for its time, is much less impressive than we've been led to believe. Roman doctors relied heavily on primitive, even barbaric practices. They used herbal remedies, bloodletting, and even animal dung to treat diseases, often with disastrous results. Despite their advancements in some fields, medicine was still largely based on superstition and trial and error. The human cost of this myth: it gave us an unrealistic view of Roman society's sophistication, overlooking the suffering caused by ineffective and dangerous medical treatments. Many people died from conditions that modern medicine could have easily cured. Roman society was complex, but their approach to medicine was not as groundbreaking as we've been taught. The next chapter will explore another dark chapter of history: the so-called bloody actions of the Aztecs. Chapter 19. The merciless Aztecs myth. When most people think of the Aztecs, they envision a violent, bloodthirsty civilization, obsessed with human sacrifice. This portrayal has overshadowed the true complexity of their society. While it's true that the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice as part of their religious beliefs, it wasn't the barbaric slaughter it's often made out to be. Sacrifices were viewed as necessary offerings to the gods, ensuring the survival of their people. Moreover, the Aztecs were skilled in agriculture, engineering, and astronomy. The human cost of this myth? It erased the Aztecs' achievements, turning them into symbols of barbarism rather than acknowledging their advanced culture and contributions to science and the arts. The myth of the merciless Aztecs isn't the only example of historical distortion. Next, we'll explore the true story behind one of the most celebrated revolutions in history, the French Revolution. Chapter 20. The Bloody French Revolution. Myth: the French Revolution is often depicted as a bloody, chaotic uprising, with mobs of angry peasants storming the streets and guillotining the aristocracy. While violence was indeed a part of the revolution, the full story is far more complex. The revolution was born out of economic hardship, political corruption, and a deeply unequal society. The bloodshed that followed was fueled by desperation and a broken system. Not just mindless violence. Many of the revolutionaries believed they were fighting for liberty, equality, and fraternity, ideals that would change the world. The human cost of this myth. It simplifies the motivations behind the revolution and obscures the legitimate grievances that led to the uprising. It also diminishes the idealism that many revolutionaries fought for, making the entire movement seem chaotic and irrational. The next myth reveals the true story of a king who is often misunderstood. King Arthur, whose legend has been twisted over centuries. Chapter 21. The Inventor. Thomas Edison myth. Thomas Edison is often celebrated as the brilliant inventor of the electric light bulb, but the truth is more complicated. Edison's success came not just from his own ingenuity, but from his aggressive tactics to discredit rivals. Edison did not invent the light bulb. Rather, he improved upon existing designs. His invention was built on the work of others, including Joseph Swan, who had already developed a functional bulb. Edison's true genius was in his ability to market and monopolize the idea, crushing competitors through legal battles and public smear campaigns. The human cost of this myth. It erases the contributions of other inventors and innovators, casting Edison as the sole genius behind an invention that was the result of collective progress. This myth of the lone genius is pervasive in history. The next chapter uncovers another misleading legend about the Salem witch trials. Chapter 22. The unjust witch hunts myth. The Salem witch trials are often portrayed as a product of mass hysteria and religious intolerance. But the full story behind these trials reveals a much darker and more systematic abuse of power. While it's true that fear and superstition played a major role, the witch hunts were also driven by social, political, and economic tensions. Land disputes, personal vendettas, and the desire for power all fueled the accusations. Women, particularly those on the margins of society, were often the targets. The human cost of this myth. It oversimplifies the motives behind the witch hunts, turning them into a tragic yet irrational event. It obscures the real power dynamics at play and fails to acknowledge how those in power exploited fear for their own gain. The myth of witch hunts is just one example of history's dark twists. The next chapter will uncover how the brutal Roman gladiator games were far more complicated than the bloodshed we imagine. Chapter 23. The brutal Roman gladiators myth. When we think of Roman gladiators, we often picture brutal bloodbaths in the arena, where fighters battled to the death for the entertainment of the masses. But this popular image is misleading. While gladiatorial combat was violent, many gladiators were skilled athletes who fought for fame and glory, not just survival. They were often treated like celebrities, with fan followings and sponsors. Contrary to popular belief, many gladiators fought in relatively controlled environments, and some even won their freedom after proving themselves. The human cost of this myth? It reduces gladiators to mere victims of violence. Ignoring the complexity of their role in Roman society, it also oversimplifies their experiences, ignoring the honour and respect they often received. The next myth takes us to the infamous conquistadors, who are often seen as brutal colonizers. But were they really the savage invaders history makes them out to be? Let's find out. Chapter 24. The Savage Conquistadors. It's the Mayfareth. The Spanish conquistadors are often portrayed as ruthless invaders, pillaging the New World and slaughtering entire civilizations. While their conquests were undoubtedly violent, the story of the conquistadors is more nuanced. Many of the conquistadors, like Hernán Cortés, were not just conquerors. They were also ambitious explorers and empire builders. Their encounters with indigenous peoples were often far more complicated than simply bloodthirsty invasions. There were alliances formed, negotiations made, and many indigenous groups saw the conquistadors as potential allies against their rivals. The human cost of this myth. It oversimplifies the interactions between the Spanish and indigenous peoples, painting them as purely adversarial. It ignores the role of indigenous alliances in the downfall of empires like the Aztecs and Incas. The myth of the conquistadors isn't the only story we've misunderstood. The next chapter will explore the noble nature of the Crusades, which weren't as righteous as history has led us to believe. Chapter 25. The Noble Crusades. The Crusades are often depicted as holy wars fought to reclaim Jerusalem from the infidel and spread Christianity. But the reality of these religious wars is far more complicated and far more violent. While religion was certainly a motivating factor, the Crusades were also driven by greed, territorial expansion, and political power. The Crusaders often targeted not just Muslims but also Jews, Eastern Christians, and anyone who stood in the way of their conquest. The wars were marked by massacres, looting, and brutal atrocities. The human cost of this myth. It romanticised the Crusaders as noble warriors, obscuring the true violence of the campaigns. The Crusades were far less about faith and far more about political and economic gain. The distortion of history continues. In the next chapter, we'll examine the myth surrounding the British Empire. Was it truly as enlightened as we've been taught? Chapter 26. The Enlightened British Empire. Myth. The British Empire is often hailed as a beacon of civilization and progress, bringing order to the nations they colonised. But this narrative is based on a deeply flawed understanding of the empire's true impact. While the British Empire did introduce some infrastructure and trade to its colonies, it also exploited resources, suppressed cultures, and imposed racial hierarchies. Colonisation led to immense suffering, from forced labour to famines caused by mismanagement and exploitation. The myth of the benevolent empire obscures the widespread violence and inequality that were foundational to its success. The human cost of this myth. It erases the suffering of colonised peoples and distorts the real legacy of the empire, which is one of exploitation and oppression. The distortion of history isn't limited to the British Empire. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the myth surrounding one of the most revered American figures, Abraham Lincoln. Chapter 27. The Innocent Abraham Lincoln Myth. Abraham Lincoln is often portrayed as the great emancipator, solely responsible for ending slavery and uniting the nation. But this image is an oversimplification of Lincoln's actions and motivations. While Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was a pivotal moment, it was a strategic move, not purely a moral stance. He initially sought to preserve the Union, and the abolition of slavery was more a means to that end than an inherent goal. Lincoln's personal views on race were complex and evolved over time. The human cost of this myth. It creates a simplified narrative that obscures the political and social realities of his presidency. Lincoln's role in the abolition of slavery is important, but it's crucial to understand the full context of his actions. But this is just the beginning of how historical figures have been mythologized. In the next chapter, we'll unravel the story of the witch hunts that devastated entire communities. Chapter 28. The Wicked Salem Witch Trials. Myth. The Salem witch trials are often portrayed as the result of mass hysteria, where innocent people were wrongly accused of witchcraft due to fear and superstition. But the true story is far more sinister and complex. While fear certainly played a role, the trials were driven by personal rivalries, land disputes, and social control. Those who were accused of witchcraft were often marginalised women, many of whom were seen as threats to the established social order. The trials became a way to settle scores and seize land or power. The human cost of this myth. It oversimplifies the motivations behind the witch hunts, turning them into a tragic but irrational event. The real story is one of manipulation and exploitation, where the accused were used as pawns in a much larger game. The myth of witch hunts doesn't end here. The next chapter will uncover another historical distortion, the brutal image of the Vikings that's lasted for centuries. Chapter 29, the harmless British Empire myth. The British Empire is often remembered as a force for good, bringing civilization, order, and progress to the colonies it controlled. This myth has persisted for centuries, shaping how we view Britain's role in history. In reality, the British Empire was built on exploitation, violence, and the subjugation of entire peoples. Colonized nations were stripped of resources, cultures were destroyed, and people were forced into labor or slavery. The so-called civilizing mission was a convenient justification for imperial domination. The human cost of this myth. It erases the suffering of millions of people who endured brutality in the name of British imperialism. The legacy of colonialism still affects these nations today, from economic inequalities to cultural erasure. But the myth of imperial benevolence wasn't the only one that shaped history. The next chapter reveals the manipulation of American history through the myth of the Founding Fathers. Chapter 30. The Foolish Trojans Myth. The story of the Trojan War and the fall of Troy has long been one of the most famous myths in Western history. But the truth behind this ancient tale has been distorted for centuries. While the Trojan horse and the epic conflict were celebrated as heroic tales of war and deceit, historical evidence suggests that Troy's fall was far more complex. Troy wasn't an isolated city, but part of a larger network of city-states. Its fall likely came from a combination of internal collapse and external invasion, not just the clever Greek trickery of the horse. The human cost of this myth. It romanticised war and heroism while ignoring the real suffering of the civilians caught in the crossfire. The story of Troy became a symbol of great men overcoming obstacles, while the true devastation faced by the ordinary people was forgotten. The myth of heroic warfare doesn't stop here. Next, we'll explore how the Vikings, far from being mindless savages, were innovators who changed history. Chapter 31. The Drunken Vikings. Myth. Vikings are often portrayed as drunken, barbaric raiders, driven solely by plunder and violence. This image of the Vikings is so entrenched in popular culture that it's hard to see them as anything else. But the reality is far more complex. While Viking raids were violent, their society was centered around trade, exploration, and settlement. They built sophisticated ships that allowed them to travel vast distances, establishing trade routes and cultural exchanges across Europe, Asia, and even North America. Their legal systems and social structures were advanced for their time. The human cost of this myth? It oversimplifies the Viking legacy, turning them into nothing more than violent invaders. This portrayal ignores their remarkable contributions to exploration, governance, and culture. The distortion of history doesn't end with the Vikings. The next chapter reveals another lie that has overshadowed the achievements of the ancient world, the image of Cleopatra as the perfect Egyptian queen. Chapter 32. The Unimportant Egyptian Women. Myth. Ancient Egypt is often portrayed as a male-dominated society, with queens like Cleopatra overshadowed by their male counterparts. But the truth about women in ancient Egypt is far more complicated and far more significant than we've been taught. While Cleopatra is remembered for her relationships with powerful men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, she was also an astute and capable ruler. In her own right, women in ancient Egypt held significant political, economic and religious power, with female pharaohs like Hatshepsut and Sobekneferu ruling as sovereigns. The human cost of this myth. It downplays the essential role women played in shaping Egypt's legacy and reduces powerful female rulers to mere political pawns. The erasure of Egyptian women from history is just one of many distortions. In the next chapter, we'll uncover how King Arthur, often seen as a symbol of nobility, was the subject of a long-standing myth that misrepresents his reign. Chapter 33. The exaggerated King Arthur myth. King Arthur has been immortalised as the epitome of chivalry, justice and heroism. His legend, complete with the sword Excalibur, the Knights of the Round Table and the quest for the Holy Grail, is a staple of Western culture. But the reality of Arthur's reign is far more obscure. The story of King Arthur likely evolved from a mix of historical and mythical figures, and there's little evidence that a single man named Arthur ever ruled over Camelot. The legend was embellished over centuries, growing more fantastical with each retelling. The human cost of this myth. It idealised medieval kingship and oversimplified the complex social and political struggles of the time. The legend of King Arthur became a symbol of an idealised past, while obscuring the harsher realities of life in the medieval world. But Arthur's myth isn't the only one that's been distorted over time. In the next chapter, we'll dive into how the Celts, once celebrated for their heroism, have been misrepresented as savages. Chapter 34. The violent Celts myth. The Celts are often depicted as wild, untamed warriors, driven by violence and chaos. But this view of the Celts is not only inaccurate, it completely oversimplifies their rich and complex culture. In reality, the Celts were highly organised and sophisticated people. They had advanced skills in metalworking, a vibrant artistic culture, and complex religious practices. Their warriors were skilled in battle, but they were also traders, farmers, and artisans. They weren't just a group of violent marauders, they were a culture with a deep respect for community and tradition. The human cost of this myth. It reduced the Celts to a stereotype, ignoring their true contributions to art, culture, and governance. Their legacy was overshadowed by the idea that they were nothing more than bloodthirsty fighters. The myth of Celtic violence isn't the only historical distortion we'll reveal. In the next chapter, we'll tackle another myth about the savage Huns and their infamous leader, Attila. Chapter 35. The false witch hunts myth. Witch hunts are often portrayed as senseless acts of violence fueled purely by superstition. While fear and ignorance played a role, the witch hunts were also about power, control, and persecution. The witch trials were not simply a matter of ignorant mobs chasing after supposed witches. They were strategic campaigns aimed at eliminating perceived threats to social order. In many cases, these trials were used as tools for religious and political authorities to exert control over communities, especially women. The human cost of this myth. It oversimplifies the motivations behind the witch hunts, failing to recognise the ways in which they were used to settle scores, gain land, and suppress dissent. Women, in particular, were the primary targets of these trials, subjected to torture, death, and disgrace. The witch hunts were a tragic result of the intersection of fear and power. In the next chapter, we'll explore another powerful myth, the so-called ruthless Mongols. Chapter 36. The ruthless Mongol conquests myth. The Mongols are often remembered as ruthless, bloodthirsty conquerors under the leadership of Genghis Khan. While their military campaigns were certainly brutal, they were also highly strategic and transformative. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they built one of the largest empires in history, creating stable trade routes, promoting cultural exchange, and spreading knowledge across vast regions. Their empire connected the East and West, allowing ideas, technology, and goods to flow freely between civilizations. The human cost of this myth? It reduces the Mongols to nothing more than mindless destroyers, ignoring their role in shaping world history. They weren't just conquerors, they were builders of an empire that fostered innovation and unity across cultures. This myth of the ruthless Mongols has persisted for centuries. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the myth of the noble founding fathers and reveal how their legacy is far more complicated than we've been told. Chapter 37. The noble founding fathers myth. The founding fathers of the United States are often portrayed as paragons of virtue, champions of liberty, who fought for freedom and equality. But the truth is more complicated than the myth suggests. Many of the founding fathers, while advocating for freedom from British tyranny, were also slaveholders who benefited from the institution of slavery. Figures like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson fought for liberty, but not for everyone. enslaved people were excluded from the vision of freedom that the founding fathers promoted. The human cost of this myth. It ignores the fact that these noble leaders were complicit in the very systems of oppression they claimed to oppose. Their legacy is tainted by their acceptance of slavery, and their vision of freedom was incomplete and selective. The myth of the noble founders doesn't end there. The next chapter reveals the harsh truths about the Spanish Inquisition and the myth of its harmless religious zealotry. Chapter 38. The harmless Spanish Inquisition myth. The Spanish Inquisition is often portrayed as a medieval religious institution that was simply misguided in its pursuit of heretics. But the reality of the Inquisition was far more brutal and far-reaching. While the Inquisition is commonly seen as an unfortunate chapter in religious history, it was in fact a tool of political power and control. Those accused of heresy were often tortured and executed, not just for their beliefs, but for their political or social status. The Inquisition wasn't just about faith, it was about silencing dissent. The human cost of this myth? It downplays the terror and suffering that people endured under the Inquisition, and it simplifies the complex role it played in enforcing political control. Thousands were killed or forced to convert, and entire communities were shattered by fear. The truth behind the Inquisition is far darker than we've been led to believe. The next myth reveals the manipulation of history surrounding one of the greatest medieval conflicts, the War of the Roses. Chapter 39. The exaggerated War of the Roses myth. The War of the Roses is often depicted as a brutal, chaotic series of battles for the English throne, with noble houses warring over power. While it was indeed violent, the truth behind the conflict is far more intricate. The war wasn't just a struggle for power between two factions, it was rooted in deep political and social unrest. The conflict involved complex alliances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties that went beyond the simple fight between the houses of Lancaster and York. It was as much about control over resources and land as it was about the crown. The human cost of this myth? It oversimplifies the nature of the war, reducing it to a series of battles between two families, rather than understanding the broader social and economic turmoil that fueled the conflict. The War of the Roses was a product of systemic instability. The myths surrounding historical battles don't stop there. The next chapter will reveal the real story behind Cleopatra's image and how history has distorted her legacy. Chapter 40. The charming Cleopatra myth. Cleopatra has long been portrayed as the ultimate seductress, a woman who used her beauty and charm to manipulate powerful men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But this myth fails to capture her true political acumen and intelligence. Cleopatra was far more than a beauty. She was a shrewd and capable ruler who skillfully navigated the complex politics of both Egypt and Rome. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony were strategic, aimed at securing Egypt's independence and power in a rapidly changing world. She wasn't a passive object of desire, she was a leader in her own right. The human cost of this myth. It reduces Cleopatra to a mere pawn in a political game, overshadowing her true accomplishments as a ruler and diplomat. Her legacy as a powerful queen has been distorted by a myth that diminishes her strength and intellect. But Cleopatra's manipulation isn't the only one that shaped history. The next myth examines the real story behind the pillaging Huns. Chapter 41. The pillaging Huns myth. The Huns are often remembered as ruthless invaders who swept through Europe, wreaking havoc and terrorizing civilizations. Led by the infamous Attila, they've been painted as nothing more than savage destroyers. But the true story of the Huns is far more complex. While Attila and his forces did indeed engage in brutal campaigns, the Huns were also skilled tacticians and diplomats. They established complex political relationships and trade routes, playing a significant role in shaping the future of Europe. Attila wasn't just a barbarian, he was a ruler who understood power, using diplomacy and military might to create a vast empire. The human cost of this myth. It reduces the Huns to mere villains, ignoring their influence on Europe's development, and their role in connecting East and West. Attila was far more than a bloodthirsty conqueror. The distortion of history continues in the next chapter, as we examine the supposed ruthless Genghis Khan and the Mongols. Chapter 42. The ruthless Genghis Khan. Myth Genghis Khan is often portrayed as the epitome of a ruthless conqueror, one who destroyed cities and slaughtered millions in his quest for empire. While his campaigns were certainly brutal, the full story is far more nuanced. Genghis Khan was not just a conqueror, he was a visionary leader who built one of the largest empires in history. He promoted trade, communication, and cultural exchange across vast territories. Under his rule, the Silk Road flourished, and technologies and ideas spread between East and West. His governance system was innovative, promoting religious tolerance and merit-based leadership. The human cost of this myth. It obscures Genghis Khan's accomplishments, reducing him to a symbol of mindless destruction while ignoring his contributions to the modern world. He wasn't just a savage conqueror, he was a transformative figure. The Mongols weren't the only empire misunderstood in history. Next, we tackle the distorted myth of the defeated Aztecs. Chapter 43. The defeated Aztecs myth. The fall of the Aztec Empire is often portrayed as a story of a superior civilization, easily crushed by a handful of Spanish conquistadors. But this myth vastly oversimplifies the events that led to the Aztecs' downfall. While Hernán Cortés played a key role in the conquest, the Aztec Empire was already struggling with internal strife, weakened by years of political instability and a series of oppressive alliances with neighbouring tribes. The Aztecs weren't defeated by mere force, they were betrayed by fractured alliances and disease. The idea that a small group of invaders easily overthrew the mighty Aztecs is simply false. The human cost of this myth. It reduces the complexity of the Aztec Empire's collapse, ignoring the role of indigenous allies and the devastating impact of European diseases. The true story is far more complicated and tragic. The myth of the defeated Aztecs was just one of many. In the next chapter, we'll explore the barbaric history of Chinese dynasties, often misrepresented as cruel and oppressive. Chapter 44. The barbaric Chinese dynasties. Machinima myth Chinese history is often painted in broad strokes as a tale of dynastic cruelty, with emperors depicted as ruthless tyrants, oppressing their people with violence and fear. But this myth oversimplifies the complexity of China's dynastic rule. While there were certainly periods of harsh rule and conflict, many Chinese dynasties were known for their achievements in governance, philosophy, and culture. The Tang and Song dynasties, for example, were periods of tremendous cultural growth with advancements in science, technology, and art. China was a centre of trade, learning, and innovation long before the West. The human cost of this myth. It reduces China's dynastic history to a series of violent rulers, ignoring the achievements that laid the foundation for much of modern civilization. But the distortion of history isn't limited to China. The next myth reveals how industrialization wasn't the smooth, unstoppable force of progress it's often portrayed to be. Chapter 45. The Unstoppable. Industrial Revolution myth. The Industrial Revolution is often depicted as a period of inevitable progress, where society transitioned seamlessly from agrarian to industrial, and everything improved. The truth is much darker. The Industrial Revolution did lead to groundbreaking advancements, but it came at a staggering human cost. Child labour, unsafe working conditions, and environmental destruction were rampant. Entire families worked long hours in dangerous factories for barely enough to survive. While factory owners grew rich, workers endured unimaginable hardships. The human cost of this myth. It glosses over the exploitation that fueled industrial growth. The revolution wasn't just about progress, it was about profits built on the backs of the most vulnerable. The myth of the Industrial Revolution's inevitability ignores the very real struggles of those who powered it. And this isn't the only myth about progress we've been told. The truths behind these lies are finally coming to light. Chapter 46. The Mysterious Stonehenge. Myth for centuries, Stonehenge has been shrouded in mystery, often depicted as an ancient site of pagan rituals or extraterrestrial influence. This myth has captivated imaginations worldwide, but modern archaeology has revealed a much more grounded truth. Stonehenge was likely a place for early human ritual, linked to astronomical alignments and ceremonial gatherings. It wasn't built by mysterious outsiders. It was the work of sophisticated Neolithic peoples who were deeply in tune with the land and the cosmos. But what other ancient wonders have been misunderstood? You might be surprised by what we uncover next. Chapter 47. the barbaric Mongol Empire myth. The Mongols are often remembered for their conquests and the bloodshed that followed, but the popular narrative overlooks the contributions they made to the world. Genghis Khan and his descendants didn't just pillage, they promoted cultural exchange, built roads and opened trade routes between the east and west. The Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace across the empire, allowed ideas, technologies, and goods to spread more freely than ever before. So, what's the real story behind their empire's legacy? Stay tuned to discover how the Mongols changed history in unexpected ways. Chapter 48. The Crusader. King Richard the Lionheart myth. Richard the Lionheart is often romanticised as the heroic knight of the Third Crusade, a noble leader defending Christendom against the Saracens. However, this idealised image obscures the fact that Richard was more of a warlord than a chivalrous knight. He spent very little time in England during his reign, focusing instead on his military campaigns. His kingdom was left vulnerable and poorly managed in his absence, and much of his crusading was motivated by a thirst for glory and territorial gain rather than religious zeal. But Richard wasn't the only historical figure whose image has been drastically altered. The next myth we're about to reveal will completely change how you see one of history's greatest monarchs. Chapter 49. The Glorious British Colonisation Myth. For decades, the British Empire has been portrayed as a force for civilization and global progress. In truth, colonisation was a system built on exploitation, extraction, and the subjugation of entire populations. The myth of the civilizing mission ignored the violence, economic oppression, and cultural erasure inflicted upon indigenous peoples across the empire. British imperialism led to widespread suffering, with lasting impacts on the economies and societies of colonised regions. But the British weren't the only empire with a darker side. In the next chapter, we'll uncover the real story behind another so-called civilizing mission. Chapter 50. The Pure Renaissance Myth. The Renaissance is often celebrated as a time of intellectual and artistic flourishing, a rebirth of culture and human potential. But this myth glosses over the darker side of the period, namely the rise of slavery, colonialism, and the exploitation of non-European peoples. While Europe experienced cultural advancements, it was simultaneously engaging in brutal conquests and colonial exploitation, especially in Africa and the Americas. The flourishing of European arts and sciences came at the expense of millions of lives across the globe. So, how did the so-called Golden Age come at such a high cost? Keep watching as we reveal the hidden truth behind this iconic period of history. The myths we've uncovered are more than just historical inaccuracies. They've shaped our understanding of the past, distorting entire civilizations and erasing countless lives. These lies weren't just innocent misunderstandings, they were deliberate manipulations designed to simplify complex histories and justify actions that caused immense suffering. From the Dark Ages to the supposed ruthless conquerors, each myth had a human cost, one that still reverberates through society today. By exposing these historical falsehoods, we not only reclaim lost truths, but also honour the resilience of those whose stories were buried. The world we know has been built on stories, but the question is, whose stories are we telling? As we uncover these truths, we begin to rewrite history, not just to correct the past, but to ensure we don't repeat the mistakes of the future. History is far more complicated than we've been led to believe, and now it's time to face it head on.